Right, welcome back everybody. I think I may have been incorrect about the biscuits, but there was cake. So hopefully no one's too disappointed. So welcome back. So next up, a really good start this morning, I think, from the Mayor, Andy Street, and lots going on, and lots of really great examples and some good stats in there and some good case studies as well. So that's kind of set us up nicely for the day, I think. And the next panel is all about the missing million, so the labour market in 2022. So I was talking this morning about the fact that we've had people over the age of 50 and people with long-term sickness leaving the labour market. And in fact, there's 1 million fewer people in the labour market than if pre-pandemic trends had continued. So this helps to explain why, even though employment is lower still than before the pandemic, employers are finding it difficult to fill all of their jobs. Now, our research shows the UK is unique in the G7 in seeing this pattern. So either our over 50s are uniquely sick of work and rich enough not to worry about it in the G7, or something may have gone awry, and you can probably tell my prejudice in that as to what the answer might be. So we're going to discuss a little bit about that and what we can do to change it and to think about how we meet employer needs and get more people chances to work and to get on in their careers. So we've got three brilliant speakers to kick us off, and then there'll be lots of time for Q&A and discussion as well. We're going to start off with Richard Clifton, who's the Managing Director of Employability at Shaw Trust. And then we're going to move on to Shazia Ijaz, who's the Director of Campaigns at the Employers Confederation, close. And then on to Kim Chaplin, who's the Associate Director for Work at the Centre for Ageing Better. So they're going to give us a little bit of an introduction from their perspective, and then, as I say, we're going to open it up to some Q&A as well. So Richard, if we start with you, I know Shaw Trust does a lot of work, in particular people with disabilities, but lots of other people as well. What's your perspective on the state of play and what we can do to make things better?
So I think, first, welcome everybody. It's great to be the headline sponsor as far as Shaw Trust is concerned. I think at this point, actually this convention comes at a time where it's quite a critical moment, as Stephen's just set out. What's heartening to hear, and I suppose from Andy Street, is that we've got politicians that also seem to be acknowledging that sort of skills development and employment is important, that we work together, and they are acknowledging it is a route out of the cost of living crisis and that key to aspiration. But I suppose the question that I was asked to address was, how do we get these people back to work? And I think we've got an unemployment rate at under 4%, but that's really disguising the amount of lack of participation within the overall market. And I think we do need to address that. And some of the problem is those people aren't going into job centres. They're not necessarily claiming the out-of-work traditional benefits. So we need to look at different approaches. We have programmes out there, like the Work and Health programme. We could look at extending the eligibility to actually bring more people into it. Funnily enough, I know that we're not hitting the referral levels that we were expecting to in Birmingham, but Andy Street's telling me that he's going into job centres just like we are and seeing that there are loads of people that want that type of support. So we do need to do that, but we also do need to look at those local interventions and how we actually target those. I think we do need to look at some universal access programmes. But I think what we're learning from the work that we're doing, delivering the Work and Health programme, and from what we did on JET and things like that, is that we need to think about getting more people onto those programmes. And actually, is it around going for a self-referral route or opening it up to more people, not just relying on job centres? Because that in itself has become the barrier. You have to be on an out-of-work benefit. You have to be unemployed for 6 to 12 months before anything kicks in. And if you're on something like person-dependent payments, you're not even eligible to go into the programmes, and they're the ones that people actually want. There's a lot of those that actually do want to go into work. So it's just exacerbating the actual problem itself. What I would, and I'm going to put a suggestion out there as far as short trust is concerned, probably want to look at DWP. They've got an opportunity come 2024 to recommission a lot of the programmes. I think there is a need for 3 programmes. One, which is your core programme. I think there's a lot we could learn from JETS and potentially from Restart and how that core programme, but that kicking in at the 6 to 12 month stage, possibly nearer the 6 month stage, to give that general support. We do desperately still need a health and disability programme though. So to think that we can have a single programme isn't going to work. So we need a specialist programme for health and disability to give that additional support, and looking at the IPS model and some of the benefits we get from is the ways we can scale that up so people get more support in the workplace to remain there. But we need a third programme that is actually co-commissioned by DWP, by DFE and local authorities, with local authorities taking the strategic lead of skills development and employment at a local level. If we get those 3 right, I think we can overcome a number of the issues. But we do need to look at this. From a short trust point of view, we have a child to career strategy, and that's the approach that we'd like to see taken. So we do need to actually start to look at how we have careers education and working all the way through to skills and employment to have a joined up approach across government and both national and local to actually address a number of the issues.
Great, thank you, Richard. So there's kind of lots there about who do we focus support on, but also how do we get it to them, and some of the stuff we were talking about with Andy in the first session, actually, about joining things up and being more integrated. Let's move on to Shazia now. I know the recruitment industry has been really buoyant, recruitment market's been really buoyant, and I know you've been doing a lot of research around where we are now and how we can further improve things. So interested to get your perspective.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to use slides, but I promise you I'm not going to bore you to death. So, the REC is the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, so we collect a lot of data. Our members are recruiters, so we know what's going on in terms of people hiring permanent placements versus temporary placements. And I thought before we get into labour shortages, I'd just give you a sense of what's going on in terms of hiring out there. So we've seen that there's been a little bit of a drop in permanent placements. So Stephen was saying, actually people have been hiring a lot, trying to sort of make up for what happened during the pandemic. And so the employment market's been very buoyant, but it's also been very tight. We'll come on to talk about that. And permanent staff demand, even though the placements have fallen, the demand essentially is still rising. So people still want to recruit in permanent roles, and they still want to recruit in temporary roles in particular. But this last bullet point here is crucial. The candidate availability of permanent staff continues to fall and fell for the 21st month running in October. So clearly that is a problem. And we'll come on to talk about that now in a bit more detail. So in the summer, we published a report called Overcoming Shortages. And the key thing is we've known that there have been labour shortages for a long time. However, during, we had Brexit and we had the pandemic, and where there was issues around shortages in certain sectors beforehand, we saw that all across the board, across all sectors. And, you know, we've been talking to government departments, various government departments about this, but essentially not enough was being done about it. So we thought, right, let's get a report out there which essentially gives some evidence on the economic impact of growth, of not having enough people in the labour market to produce the kind of growth and productivity that government want. So that's what we did, and we looked at also how some other G7 countries are going about doing, quite frankly, better than the UK, I'm afraid, on tackling shortages and the difficulties that UK businesses are exploring, what difficulties they're facing, and looking at essentially what businesses and government need to do to work together to overcome some of these shortages. So essentially, we did some economic modelling, which shows that over the next 5 years, if we continue to to get anemic growth and stagnant productivity, essentially that will continue to happen if we do not do anything to fix the labour and skills shortages that we've got. So we modelled a hypothetical, but definitely not an inconceivable 10% increase in demand for, in the economy. That would need 1.7 million more jobs to deliver that demand. And without the employment increase, we could see a real UK GDP fall by 2027 of between 30 and 39 billion pounds every year. And when we think about the Chancellor who's probably getting ready to speak soon, and we're thinking about the sort of growth forecasts that are going on and the savings that they're trying to make in the economy, and then we look at that figure, you know how important it is to get this right. So that's an equivalent of 1.2 to 1.6% of GDP that we will be missing out on. And the modelling analysis also shows that, obviously, we know this, that a demand boost in the face of shortages leads to higher earnings and inflation, which is what we're seeing now. And that does also mean a restricted growth in public sector receipts. Back to the Chancellor's statement. So essentially, what we're saying and what we've been saying to government departments for a long time now is that we absolutely need to have a plan for workforce planning that is worked on between government and business, and it needs to be pushed up the agenda. These are some recommendations for businesses, because they've obviously got to play their part as well. We want them to see that actually investing in skills for their staff is exactly that. It's an investment, and they shouldn't be seeing it as a cost. And that any long-term commercial strategy that businesses are putting in place needs to include a people plan as well. And that we obviously have got a restricted talent pool at the moment. So people talk about the importance of equality, diversity and inclusion. It is absolutely crucial that employers right now are recruiting from the broadest talent pool that they've got. So they've got to be making sure that they have the right access into diverse groups. And I know Richard's talked about it a bit there with disability, and I know Kim was going to talk about that with older workers. So those people cannot be ignored. And the other thing, this is again very crucial, because we're all sort of, you know, I wasn't sure I was going to get here today on the train, and we've seen that nurses have been balloted as well. It's really important that in this environment, employers do deploy very good employee relations and make sure that they are motivating their staff to stick with them. So we move on to some recommendations for government. We can't do this, business can't do this alone, and government can't do it alone. So we've suggested that there should be a cohesive future workforce strategy for the UK, and that we want it to have a home in the government so that it doesn't get lost, it doesn't fall between departments. We've seen a lot of change in government recently, and we think that something like a future workforce strategy needs to make sure that there's accountability in what it delivers. So maybe it sits in the Cabinet Office, maybe there's an independent commission, but essentially business and government need to come together. We want skills policies that catalyse private sector investment. So the REC, and I know many other organisations, have been calling for the reform of the apprenticeship levy for some time, because there's more people that are paying into the levy than obviously can access the funds to get people trained up, and the apprenticeship startups have been going down. We were hopeful. We knew that the Treasury were doing a review on this recently, but obviously there's been change, and we had the fallout from the mini-budget. So I'm not particularly hopeful that we will see change on that today, unfortunately. Going back to what Richard was talking about is that local, that joined-up approach locally. So, you know, we support the local skills improvement plans across England. We want that to be expanded, and we really want people locally that know the jobs market, like recruiters, to be involved in that, so they can help determine, based on what employers are looking for, the sorts of skills that need to be delivered locally. a tax credit scheme for employers that invest in training. In particular, we're thinking at the REC about the future jobs, green jobs. Obviously, we've got to reach our COP commitments, and at the moment, we don't seem to be planning for the skills around the jobs that will help us deliver that. So that really has to be addressed urgently. And then there are basic things, you would think there were basic things that the government can do quite relatively easily, is like extending work visas from the sort of 2 to 3 year term to 5 years. Canada's doing that very effectively. And obviously, this is some of the stuff that we hope doesn't get completely cut back today in the Chancellor's statement. We need those support infrastructures like transport and like childcare costs to come down so that people can actually access the labour market. And then we talk about having mandating ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting. There was some hope that ethnicity pay gap reporting was going to be mandated, but that seems to be, again, on the back burner. We're out there trying to raise the profile of these issues as much as possible, and look forward to speaking to you more. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shazia. And the report that you talked about there is broadly consistent with, we estimated that aiming for an 80% employment rate, which is would be the highest in the G7 and in line with some countries like the Netherlands, that would boost the economy by something like £23 billion. So kind of consistent with, basically it's a lot of money. You can tell Shazia and I both used to work for the Treasury, I think probably in that. So yeah, there's a kind of big economic prize here as well as the social prize and all the rest of it as well. Kim, I think you've got some slides as well. Very interested to hear about the work the Centre for Ageing Better is doing around this and what we can do to do better.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Kim Chaplin, as Stephen has said. I work for the Centre for Ageing Better, and just in case people don't know what that is, it's a What Works organisation. The focus of the Centre for Ageing Better is extending the quality of later lives. We're evidence-based, and we work in key areas where we know there'll be an impact and a change. And one of the big key areas that we want to see a difference is we want to see extended working lives. There's really, really clear evidence that extended working lives not only benefits the economy because of demographics, but it benefits the individual. Well, most of the individuals anyway. It's not just about financial inclusion, it's also about social inclusion and well-being and health outcomes. So we as an organisation are working hard to look at the challenges around the current labour market and demographics and to make suggestions based on evidence about how we can make change. And really, as this slide says, what we know is that at the minute, the 50 to 70 group, that's the age group that we focus on, it is shut out to some extent of the labour market at the moment. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we think the cause of that is and actually what we think we can do to address that challenge. And I've got some nice graphs, which I know Stephen likes. So here we go. There's the problem. People in their 50s and 60s do not have equitable access. And there are structural barriers, but there are also ageist attitudes. And it's absolutely clear, and the evidence points to it, that ageism pervades. It pervades through employment and with employers. It also pervades through our supporting structures, I'm afraid, as well. So it's something that we need to address culturally as well as structurally. If we look, the two barriers we always look at, the two incidents in time that we always look at, are Brexit and COVID. But if we look at employment rates before the pandemic, what we saw was a gradual increase in the participation of the 50-plus, as we all call them, group, which is really quite interesting. What we also see, though, is that there's always a cliff edge at state pension age, so that there's a totem, if you like, with state pension makes people think about retirement, and often the response is a really sudden cliff edge stop of work. You don't see a lot of phasing. It's interesting, though, that when you look and compare the employment rate of that group with others, there's still a gap, if you like. We were seeing progression, we were seeing an improvement in participation, but we were not seeing the same rate of participation as other age groups. And when we look at that and we look at the employment rate now, we see, well, there's been a fall off. And so we tend to think, well, we were doing all right before COVID. We were seeing progression. But then COVID came along and we took a backward step. The bottom line is actually we were not doing all right before COVID. The participation rate of the 50-plus group is not where it should be. And quite frankly, my background is DWP. I worked in DWP for 30 years. And it's supporting manpower services and skills, etc. We were quite blasé about the underperformance of programs for this age group. It was almost an accepted thing that, well, you know, they work less well for this group, and it's in part because this group has different needs and they're thinking about retirement. I think we need to challenge that because that is ageism. So I'm not going to go into the detail of these stats anymore because I think we're running for time. I think what is interesting is that we need to think about this group, though, not as oh, well, there's age, and you need to deal with age. When we look at the participation and we look at the gap between the groups, what we do see is that actually women fare less well, BAMI groups fare less well, and people with long-term health issues fare less well. So within the age group, there is also less equity, and there are some barriers in there in terms of, well, some baggage, I would say, rather than barriers that we need to deal with. So these are really interesting, though, in terms of when we look at the main reasons why this group are out of work. This group tends to, if they fall out of work, become long-term employed. That is the prognosis for this group. And so when we Stephen was talking about, when we were talking about the program itself and Restart is really interesting because I think 30% of the cohort that's going through Restart is actually over 50. It's a bigger demographic than we've ever seen before. And it is interesting how the individuals get to that program and how long it takes to get them to that program. It would be much better if we could see people coming to that program earlier than they come to it at the moment. I'm not going to go into the details of some of these. Caring responsibilities is interesting as well. When we tend to talk about local infrastructure, we talk about needing to increase the childcare and reduce the cost of childcare. This age group of the squeezed generation, they are actually really pressured by caring responsibilities for their parents as well as for children. And often this group, particularly people in their mid-50s, end up taking what turn out to be temporary caring responsibilities. So they drop out of work for a period of time, and then sadly the person they're caring for actually goes into full-time care or dies. And they come back to work having had that gap. And the infrastructure isn't prepared. Well, they could come back to work having had that gap. Actually, when we look at the evidence, they don't come back to work because they've actually dropped out of the discipline completely, and it's seen as too much of a challenge. And so that is really interesting in terms of why people leave the labour market, and then we start to look at, well, why don't you come back? And what we find underneath all of these issues is, even with retirement actually, confidence and people's attitude about the labour market is a key barrier. And so when we look at the programs that make a difference, what we find is that running right the way through this is an underlying view that the world is ageist, that actually there's a view of unfairness of how the system works, and therefore a lack of confidence that you can change that, and a lack of understanding sometimes of the skill set that these individuals have got and what they can bring to the market. So it's almost like the labour market doesn't work for me, my skills are out of date, there's not a lot I can do about it, so I'll just retire. And I would point people to a really interesting study that the Phoenix group have done, the Phoenix think tank. Catherine Foote is sharing it on Twitter if you follow her. And they've looked at the qual underneath why individuals have left the labour market. And it is really interesting because we all talk about this group and their health issues and their caring responsibilities. But themed right the way through that is actually this group has just decided to have a lifestyle change, and COVID has reinforced that lifestyle change. And it's a cultural and attitude change, not a physical barrier thing that is detaching a lot of these people from work. So the other thing that we need to think about in the context of how people have changed their behaviours is that we've got a very physical thing happening, and that's the rising of the state pension age. We've got this policy to increase the state pension age, which, as I said, is a totem. It's when people start thinking about a physical change of work. And what we don't have at the minute is any underlying policies that support that increase in pension age. So what we do see, we commissioned a study with IFS, and that reported this year, and it's worth having a look at, is that the increase in the state pension age has actually just created a cohort of very poor people that are age 66 at the minute. And they have not gone on to work, and they're in absolute poverty. So we need to see a fundamental change. If we're pushing the pension age out, which is the right thing to do, quite frankly. Our pension and our social security system was made in the middle of the 20th century, and we're in the 21st, and people live a hell of a lot longer than they lived in 1948. We need to see a fundamental change in what happens to support longer working lives, how our employment support systems work, but more importantly as well, actually, how employment works as a whole. And that is really interesting because we feel quite strongly that we need to do quite a few steps. We need to take quite a few steps to accept and normalise working lives, because fundamentally they're going to extend into their 70s. They're moving in that direction now. So, as I've said, there is not sufficient. It's not sufficient just to push out the pension age. We want to see government think harder about supporting policies for longer working lives. We want to see a stronger message of support for employers, because actually it's quite challenging for employers to work in this environment. We have an initiative that we're going to launch at the end of this month with the CIPD conference, which is a call to action for employers to think differently about longer working lives and with some support. So we're asking them to pledge to be more age-friendly. And we're looking at pulling people together to think about, employers together to think about how they can do that. So I think it's quite important. It's quite an important signal to everybody that's providing into employers that employers are thinking about this group a little bit differently. When we look at their D&I policies, often they're stacking the protected characteristics, and age comes down at the bottom, which, as I've just illustrated, age isn't a separate characteristic. All the characteristics are bound up in each other. But it's a very important characteristic because the older workforce is going to be our workforce. Demographics are such that youth is going to be less of a priority, quite frankly, and age is going to become, the weight is going to shift, and so we're going to have to think more equally about the differences of these two cohorts. Employers need to think about retention and recruitment, and they need to think about the conversations they're having with individuals that work for them now in a different way. We talk about them as midlife MOTs, but we know that actually they need to start thinking about how the world of work has changed and how they equip their existing workforce to deal with that. And what is becoming more of a conversation to have is the retirement conversation or the unretirement conversation. So how do you keep that conversation going, and how do you not close the door in such a sudden way with people that are looking to reduce their work, their activity with you? So we're seeing more and more at the minute at the top end of the skills group and in the blue chip organisations, unretirement conversations going on, or sustained employment in different ways going on. So we've got some quite interesting case studies of individuals that leave the organisation but come back on a different remuneration and contract with their employer to do slightly different things, but they fill skills gaps. And that is really interesting because I think that starts to raise a whole different scenario about upskilling. We think that there should be different welfare support around this. So the 50-plus group is quite interesting because although I've talked about individuals that, work just is a good thing and it's good for them socially and it's good for them financially, there are a group of individuals, and it tends to be in the lower socioeconomic groups for whom work is not actually going to be the sustainable piece. And so we need to think about that differently instead of having a one-size-fits-all support. And finally, and most appropriately for this group today, we need to think about, in that context, how we deliver upskilling and reskilling. So we know that we've got this group that everybody wants to dip into and that people are concerned about because they're disengaged. How do you tempt them back? Because if it's a life choice, this is about tempting. It's not about sanctioning and forcing. And when you do tempt them back, how do you solve the problem that it's all right thinking, well, these guys have disengaged, but we've got a cost of living crisis, so they're going to come back because they'll have to come back because they won't be able to afford to live. That is terrible. That's a terrible scenario. But it's be an absolute miracle if when they do come back, they come back to the gaps where the skill shortages are. That's just not going to happen. And so how do we transition this group of individuals into some of the economy where we need them to go in a way that's seen as positive and tempting and helps the whole of the economy and them as individuals thrive? Because that's what we're about, really, isn't it? It's not just about growth. We're about a thriving socio-economic environment. And I think that's really interesting because at the minute, I don't think there is an offer for this group. And I definitely don't think there's a tempting skills offer for this group. And just to finish on, evidence suggests that actually the market needs to think differently about this. So we have just gone out to the market and the market hasn't responded. So we've done a piece of evidence-based learning in prototype and testing that we know will make a difference to older workers and to local economies. And I can't talk too much about it, we're still in the middle of the procurement, but one of the things we're going to have to think about is why didn't the market respond to this? And I have to say, I think one of the issues is that the market at the minute is massively geared to youth. And that's where people want to deliver these sorts of services. And so I think it does ask a question of all of us in the room about how we shift a bit to be, more geared to the challenge that we see in front of us.
Great. Thank you, Kim. Lots to think about there, including thinking about the different characteristics of people within age groups rather than just saying older people. We had the same conversation this morning at the breakfast session about young people. I think it's absolutely correct, and sometimes we miss that. And then also about what the role of the state is a little bit. So if there are people who've made a lifestyle change and can afford to do so, not necessarily the state's role to say, do you know what, you've got that wrong, we're going to sort of come and clobber you for a bit. But there are actually a lot of people in that age group who have not made that lifestyle shift, as you said, through some of those stats as well. So it feels like there's a big gap still to fill. Now we've got a bit of time for discussion and for questions. So can I ask you to put your hands up if you've got a question that you want to ask, and there will be some roving mics that will appear as well. So yes, we've got one in the back corner there, and we've got one in, I'm going to say, the middle here. We'll take the two together if we can.
Great. I'm
Yes.
Ruth Moxon from Greater London Authority. I'm interested, you've mentioned both skills as a problem for older workers and this inactivity, but also there seems an issue of flexibility and accessibility. And what do you think is more important? Is it this group don't have the skills to get back to work, or is it they want a more flexible working system? And kind of which do you think is more important?
Great. Well, we'll take the two questions together and then come across to the panel. So the hand is up just here in the middle, Abby. So just over to your left. I keep saying right, but it's my right and it's your left, which is confusing.
Hiya, it's me again. I just wanted to add an additional question to this around, obviously, funding and how people pay for things like this. So I wanted to ask the panel about the lifelong learning entitlement and the loan that's meant to be coming up, because I presented at a conference not too long ago to the adult education lead across England, and I flagged this because if we're talking about individual funding and situations which are all different and a government-led initiative, and then linking it to organisations such as universities and colleges, I've not heard anybody mention anything about the funding arrangements that are being supposedly put in place that enable people to access this money. I realise that these are an age group that's relatively older and they may be hesitant around this, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about how there's more joined upness with other parts of the education sector where this is important. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We'll take those two questions and then we'll come on to the next ones. I think I'm not supposed to answer these questions, but nonetheless, I think I think that one of the points about the lifelong learning entitlement, I think that's a brilliant thing. So giving people a loan entitlement to do sort of level 4 to 6 throughout their life. I would reflect on my question to Andy Street this morning. There's 9 million people who haven't got literacy or numeracy skills that they need, and 1 in 4, I think, who haven't got a level 2 or 3. So we kind of need that ladder up as well, which is a little bit missing, is my answer anyway. But I've now completely, I'm supposed to ask the panel the questions. So can I start with Kim, and we'll work our way sort of down, and both of those questions together, please.
So in terms of the flex versus skills, when we ask individuals, both in employment and looking for work, what is the one factor that would change their outlook and change what they're doing? It's flexibility. So individuals will stay in work longer if they can have a conversation with their employer about flexibility. And it isn't a physical, necessarily, conversation about where I do my work, what hours I do. It's about having more discretion over what I do and having more choice and that sort of thing. And in terms of the people that are not engaged at all, the one thing that would motivate them to engage is seeing a labour market that has more flexibility in it. In terms of skills, when we look at, we've done quite a bit of work in West Midlands actually around redundancy and retraining, and when we look at the skills requirements, I think the point about lifelong learning and basic skills is really interesting. The overarching need is for confidence building and for people to be able to analyse what they've got and have a self-understanding piece and be able to pitch what they've got already with what is needed in the labour market. But the first period of people almost doing that stock take is a confidence building piece. Often the fact they've exited the labour market, be it through redundancy or they're looking at change, really, really dints their self-esteem. They're not in that progression thing that young people are in. And so you have to address that before you can get into the skill space. And my final thing is when you do get into the skill space, far too often the training that's delivered is delivered in a way that somebody who is a school leaver or is in mainstream education is receiving the training. And that's quite a heavy way of delivering training for somebody who's got a lot of life skills. They probably don't need that amount of training the way it's been delivered, and they tend to turn off a little bit when it's packaged in that way. You can almost do a training light for this group.
I'll just add that to your point about flexibility. So all of our data tells us that more and more people want to work flexibly, particularly in the older worker age group. And so we need to make sure that the support systems are there to help people do that. So recruiters are very well versed in how to understand what it is that your skill set is and how you might look to transfer some of that into jobs that can be more flexible. We see, for example, that lack of access to flexible jobs is a big factor in why some people end up leaving the labour market, perhaps due to burnout. For example, in the health sector, that is a massive issue. A lot of sort of full-time permanent nurses or health staff are leaving permanent work to go and work for agencies because they want that flexibility, and quite frankly they're burnt out, and they're also nurses aren't particularly being paid enough either. So that flexible labour market is only going to continue to grow. So we need to make sure that it's working in the right way, and also that's why we at the REC bang on about reforming the apprenticeship levy, is because we want to make sure that people that want to work flexibly can also access the skills training while they are working flexibly. They can't commit to sort of a year-long apprentice. So there should be sort of shorter, more modular training courses that people can access that allows them to transition into the sort of temporary work.
So yes, I'm sort of going to echo what everybody else said in a lot of respects. I think flexibility, particularly looking at the health and disability side of employment, we've always looked at the flexibility being a fundamental part of it. And it's a lot of work that our teams do with employers to actually encourage them and actually help them adapt vacancies they've got to actually meet that flexible need of individuals. I think the skills bit is more, it's like a spaghetti junction of funding that no employer or training provider or anybody can actually find a route way of pulling this all together. We need to have a sensible approach. I think this is where devolution could help, and having a more structured approach to what we are doing to support people, particularly around when you are having the flexible work and everything else. So I think both those areas do need looking at, and we do need to address them. Simplicity is where we need to go to for actually so people can access the support they need. But I would say digital inclusion and the digital poverty for the people we're working with at the moment is a significant barrier. COVID did mean that everybody decided that we're going to move to a lot of online learning and everything else. But actually, if we've not given people the confidence, and I think it is a confidence thing, to be able to access that learning and support, actually that is going to be another significant barrier. So we do need to make sure we address that sort of digital poverty and digital accessibility as well.
Thanks, Richard. I think there's a really important point that's come out lots of the conversation so far about the role of employers, because we talk a lot about programs and we talk a lot about what we can do for people and the role of the government. But actually, this is also about employers, because if they're struggling to find people, they need to do something different. So they need to go and find them where they are, and they need to offer them jobs that they want to do. So I know lots of employers are doing that, but it's also how can we help more to think about some of the messages coming out of all of the speakers so far about what people want. So we'll take another couple of questions if we could, please. We definitely had. Oh, you've already got the mic. Excellent.
Graham Hastings-Evans, NOCN. And mine relates to the missing million and the main part of the workforce. You're right to say a lot has gone into young people, the apprenticeship levy, T-levels, etc. How are we as an economy going to fund upskilling 32.8 million people, plus the million or so that are not in the workforce at the moment that we want to get back into it, so we do create a digital and more competitive society? Because it strikes me that AEB and the levy isn't enough, and there's never been a big take-up of loans.
That's a very good question. I fear the Chancellor may not be answering that currently, but you never know.
No, I think you're right.
So let's take another question from Patrick.
Yeah, I guess my observation was going back to the start of the presentation, which was this concept of the missing millions, the percentage of the labour market that's disappeared. And so we've got this rather sort of perverse situation where all of the headline figures seem to suggest we've got jobs without people and people without jobs, and yet don't seem to be able to resolve the disconnect between those two things. And I'm just wondering whether what also needs to happen is a realisation that within the workforce is part of the answer, better focus on promotion internally, which then frees up spaces which might address some of the external people seeking work. So at the moment we seem to try and connect a percentage of available jobs with people who are so far away from that they're never going to meet it, and whether we need to rethink that becomes an employer thing again, I guess, but just that kind of thought.
Thank you. So yeah, I think so. A couple of good questions there. So what about how do we match up demand and supply, and the role of employers in doing some of that, but also goes back to some stuff Kim was saying, I think, about skills mismatches. And then Graham's question about, so yeah, we've got the adult education budget, we've got the apprenticeship levy, we've got the lifelong loan entitlement coming in, but actually, is that going to be enough given the size of the challenge and also people's propensity to take up these things as well? So two nice, easy questions. So if I start with Shazia this time.
So just some thoughts about the first question. I mean, essentially, that's why we talk a lot about, and why I talked about a lot about sort of joined up workforce planning, because we need the different departments to come together, and we need the policies to work together rather than sometimes sort of rub up against each other in the wrong way. The reality is that we need that plan for growth, and we need all of the sort of support, supply side reforms that we need to enable unlocking some of the potential of the labour market, because we have had high employment. We don't have the right skills. I talked a little bit about planning for sort of green skills and jobs of the future. Our labour market is transitioning at a very fast rate, particularly post-pandemic. So we do absolutely need to think about how we join up some of that skills planning at a local level. We need to make sure that there is ability for lots of people to train. But the reality is that if people can't get on a bus to take them to a local industrial estate to do the work, then that skills training is kind of not doing what it was meant to do. So that's why we talk about a joined up workforce strategy, and we really kind of need government to understand that their various different departments at the moment aren't all pulling in the same direction as much as often when you speak to civil servants they'd like to be doing. What was the second point was around...
So are we investing enough, or how do you get people to take this stuff up?
I think we have to be realistic about investment in the current climate. Obviously, there is always more investment that's needed, but that's why we talk a lot about businesses being incentivized to invest more as well. So I think, that would be, it's just that reminder to employers that they need to be doing their part too.
Skills tax credit we've called for as well, so I'll plug that. Now we're running a little bit short time, so relatively brief answers, if I may, from the last two panellists. We'll start with Richard and then across to Kim.
I think for me, we can almost answer both, coming back to the employer bit. I think we aren't going to have an endless budget, and probably later it'll get even more tighter, but I think there is that bit about good work in general. If we can actually work with employers to deliver good work, you get progression, to your point, which will then open up the entry-level jobs. If we can then work on a local level to actually put in route ways of training to enter the local jobs and support that progression. The employers we work with have funding and want to progress their staff in a lot of cases. They just don't necessarily know how to do it. We actually collectively need to do more work with employers to actually put that infrastructure together. Short Trust has a bit of an advantage because we have funding from multiple departments and we can bolt things together. That isn't always the case across the country, and I think that's what we need to be doing now.
And just the next speaker has literally appeared on a screen in front of me, which puts the pressure on, Kim. Just a quick sentence, if you would, please.
I totally agree. I think the devolution and good local labour market planning is essential, and in that you have to have a strong element of investment and support for employers.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, we've covered a lot of ground there. We've definitely run out of time. So thank you very much to each of our panellists for that contribution. I'm going to pass across to Naomi Phillips, our Deputy Chief Executive, to chair this next session. Whilst I'm doing so, could you say a big thank you to all of our panellists?
Good afternoon. As Stephen said, I'm Naomi. I'm Deputy Chief Executive at Learning and Work Institute, and I am so delighted to see you all today. I'm going to be chairing this next session, our second wonderful keynote for the day. Lord David Blunkett probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to give you a very short one anyway. He was obviously a long and distinguished career as an MP, former Education Secretary, former Work and Pension Secretary, former Home Secretary, and was elevated to the Lords in 2015, where he's had a really full career. But most recently, David's also been in the news because he led Labour's Council of Skills Advisors and published a report with some pretty strong recommendations to trigger what's been described as a revolution in learning and skills. I'm now just going to hand over to David to talk about building a skills nation. Thank you.
Please forgive me for not being with you in person, but I had a question in the House 10 minutes ago, which I couldn't drop. I'm sorry to divert you all from the Chancellor's autumn statement, which I hoped, but I doubt, would include something really substantial, not about tax increases and cuts, but about investment in education and skills. I fear that education has gone very much off the top of the agenda, and with it, the critical nature of investing in the skills of the future, both for growth and for productivity, but also for the well-being and cohesion and equality of our nation, and rebalancing our country, where, of course, as you all know, London and the South East compare very favourably. A comprehensive approach. People said to me, why have you mentioned schools? we discovered that the minute you started to put together a paper about skills, you had to build a jigsaw from early years onwards. And what happens
Obviously, there's been some technical difficulties. I can see David on my small screen down there, so I'm hopeful that we will be able to get him back shortly. Do we have sound? Right, fantastic. David, I think you're back up. I'm so sorry about that. Sorry, David, we're having trouble hearing you. If you could just pause just for a moment, and we'll get this sorted out as soon as we can. It's the ongoing problems of hybrid working. We are working through these, and I can see David now. So let's go back to Parliament and see if we can get that stream working again. Assuming we can get this back up and running, we are going to have some time for questions as well. So do make sure that you're prepared for those as well. So we are working very hard to resume the connection. If I could just ask everyone just to pause, chat to your neighbour just for a few minutes. We are trying our best to get that back up and running as soon as we possibly can. Thank you. Hello, Employment and Skills Convention. Thank you for being such good neighbours and chatting to each other. I'm pleased to say that we do have Lord Blunkett back on the line, so we are going to try this one more time because we are very, very keen to hear what he has to say.
I am really, really sorry. This place is falling apart, literally. If I speak very briefly, because it's more important, I think, that people raise questions, if that's acceptable, Naomi. Most people will know pretty much what I'm going to say, which is that we need both a coordinated approach at the centre, and we need the devolvement of the administration and the input, so that at local level people can adapt and adopt the strategies that are right for themselves. I'm in favour of the local skills improvement plans, but they should be a process, not a plan. They should be totally inclusive, and they should look to the future as well as the immediate skills needs. Investment now is necessary because obviously we can reduce inflation if we can fill the vacancies, if we can actually equip people with the opportunity of the moment. But it's absolutely fundamental that we also address the likely shortages and the massive change in the world of work of tomorrow, artificial intelligence and robotics, but also the need for progression in work, which you were discussing just before I attempted to come online. The strategy that we see as critical is therefore building blocks which start right the way through school, and the kind of opportunities young people have to develop critical thinking, to be able to work in teams, to be able to adapt new strategies for learning and for progression, and then to be able to offer real opportunities through apprenticeships, including higher level apprenticeships, which University of Sheffield and Warwick are pioneers in, offering opportunity of young people to be able to discover what's right for them by completely enhancing the career service and giving a major role to further education, but not in competition with higher education, but as part of a journey which people will return to throughout their life. And if we have stakeholders nationally determining the overarching plan, and we have devolution of the implementation, we believe we can make very real progress. We had enormous support from a whole range of organisations and committee bodies. We've received a very warm welcome from the CBI's TUC, from the Federation of Awarding Bodies, and from those actually in the field doing the job. I just want to mention one other issue before opening up to questions, because otherwise I shall ruin your timetable. And that is the critical nature of adapting the what we want to call the apprenticeship and learning levy to ensure that it can be used flexibly and sensibly, rather than the position that we're in at the moment, where over £3 billion of the apprenticeship levy has been clawed back by the Treasury. In that way, we can ensure that we open this up so that small and medium-sized enterprises can really benefit. For large companies, the supply chain is critical, and we believe that, for instance, having the kind of light touch umbrella organisation that those in the gene therapy sector have, which allows small and medium-sized enterprises to link together to be able to take advantage not just of the levy, but of shared apprenticeships. That kind of creative and imaginative approach is vital. I ought to just finally mention that the idea of a skills passport and the way in which people can build their skills incrementally, so that we have a modular approach to both assessment and to qualification, can allow people to build throughout their life, not just in the early years, but throughout their life, the opportunity to demonstrate their quality and their qualifications. And that applies equally to those with different forms of disability. So completely changing the way in which the important scheme Access to Work is operated, using the EHCPs from school all the way through disabled students allowance into Access to Work can make sense of allowing people who desperately want a job to be able to fill the vacancies that we desperately need to fill. Thank you very much indeed.
David, thank you so much. Sorry, I can just see a big picture for myself rather than David Blunkett on the screen, but let's try and get David up first. Thank you so much, and almost kind of called back all the time, so that's fantastic. So because David is obviously not here in person, it is even more important that when you ask a question, you use the microphone or David won't be able to hear you. So I'm going to take the, can I sort of see some hands? See this gentleman here. Let's, David, I've just got one question. I'll take them one at a time, David. I've got one question for this gentleman here. A microphone is just coming to you, just from behind you. Thank you.
David, very good morning. Question I've got to you, I think we've got to think outside the box on education. I think we're missing the mark where you're saying it's got to be localized, it's got to be actually a national, taking advantage of substantial volume discounts. The training market's changing. It changes every 6 months on skill shortages. Skillsoft and LinkedIn Learning, they've got 11,000, 18,000 courses that we can actually buy in at a fraction of the cost that the levelling up budget of 2.6 billion. You look at the education budget for adult education, £3 billion being wasted on ineffective training. You could look at the DWP, where they can't even offer employability courses for less than £2 billion. We can do that at a fraction of the cost. Let's give everyone, 30 million people in the UK, a baseline education which is of a very high level, and then outsource what else we need. And we can do that at a fraction of the cost that's currently being paid.
Thank you. Can I, sorry, just before David responds, can I just ask who you are and where you're from?
My name is Charanjit Randhawa. I'm a CEO of Epcot Career Solutions.
Okay, thank you so much. Lord Blunkett.
Okay, well, thanks very much. We actually suggested that this would be a partnership and that people who had something to offer would be welcomed into providing what you call the baseline. We were describing, for instance, in the delivery of digital skills, that everyone should have the basic entitlement and opportunity on which you could then build. But whilst there's a national imperative for everyone to have a particular level of skill, and Multiply is at least a fund that's dealing with that in terms of basic numeracy, actually quite a lot of flexibility is needed in terms of using budgets locally and enhancing what further education colleges and those like yourself as a private provider can do. So it's an inclusive agenda. You're right about DWP. We've suggested that the DFE, the BEIS and DWP should be actually joined up, and the National Skills Task Force, what Keir Starmer's calling Skills England, should actually be have the imperative of pulling those together. I had the advantage when I was Education Secretary of also being the Employment Secretary. We covered the whole field of skills and employability, which was a great advantage. We don't have that at the moment. In terms of the Constitution and the way in which government's organised, I would favour pulling these together much more coherently. So by all means, put on the agenda what you can do at a lower cost, but it has to also be part of a national strategy.
Thank you so much. Another question. So we've got the light shining white in my eyes. There was a question that I had shared on Twitter, because we asked people as well to kind of share online, David, as well. And the question was really around that kind of lifelong learning, and quite often can have a real focus on skills, on training, on jobs. But how important do you think that the kind of adult education around becoming good, well, what the question asks of becoming good adults around kind of health, democracy, citizenship, how important is that in the mix?
Well, community and adult learning has been very close to my heart. It was the first post I was given when I became a counsellor in Sheffield so long ago, I'd rather not tell you. And there's been a 25% drop in funding for adult and community learning. It is critical because it's both about inspiring people to want to continue learning. It often draws people into something that they'd never thought of before, which can be for work, but it can also be for their benefit in terms of their mental health, the avoidance of the onset of dementia. It can be about people making a contribution in the social enterprise field. It is often encouraging and supporting people to volunteer, both in terms of advice centres, but also in the teaching of English as an additional language. And all these things make up a coherent, living, vibrant community, which is, by the way, why we mention in the report the importance of learning for citizenship and democracy and skilling people to be able to take part in democracy for the future, because this has to be a holistic approach. The world of work is obviously central because that's what we were asked to do. We were asked to develop a policy relating to productivity and growth and the world of work. We widened our report to take into account exactly the question that you've been asked.
That's brilliant. Thank you for a very comprehensive answer. And actually, Learning and Work Institute are working very closely, not just in England, but also in Wales on a citizens curriculum as well, just capturing a lot of the things that you've sort of been talking about. I'm just looking for any questions from the floor. In terms of the report that you published recently, it was a very thick report, and I was actually at the launch, and I think somebody said it was only meant to be maybe 12 pages and actually became a much more substantial report. But a lot of very kind of meaty recommendations in there. I mean, it may be a slightly odd question, but do you think there's any kind of low-hanging fruit there? Like, are there any of those recommendations that you think if we took forward, they would be quite simple to do, and it's just a matter of kind of just having a bit more political will to do them, something that we could just get moving quite quickly? Because obviously some of them point to much wider systemic reform.
Yes, there are. By the way, you have to be an insomniac to read it. It turned out to be 134 pages, for which I apologise. But we did desperately try to lay out a programme that wasn't a bit here and a bit there, but some attempt at coherence. Yes, of course, I mentioned the adaptation of what is currently the apprenticeship levy. And I would have thought that was a very easy hit, because the resource is available, whatever the Chancellor of the Exchequer is saying at this very moment, because it's a levy on larger enterprises, and we're talking about £3 billion a year here. The adaptation and development of careers is a not inexpensive, but not too expensive, a way of moving very quickly and cheaply. The development of the post-16 offer, including joining up T-levels, A-levels, BTEC and apprenticeships. Some of you will be aware that I was part of a cross-party coalition in the Lords to save the BTEC National Diploma and other advanced qualifications from literally being wiped out. We've got to give those kind of routes, which make careers advice absolutely fundamental, because people learn in different ways, different times of their life, maturing differently, and that would provide us with an immediate hit. The digital thing I was mentioning earlier is something that could easily be done in terms of both schools, colleges and adult learning, if we had the will to do so. But I think I just come back to the situation here I was raising earlier. There has to be a coherence about this, because there's lots of good initiatives, great things going on, but they're just simply not joined up, and good practice isn't spread across the country or between enterprises. And we give a lot of examples of business and the contribution they're making and the changes they're bringing about by the investment, but not just in their own workforce, but by social responsibility and their understanding. It may be controversial to just use this as an example because of the bitter hatred by some people of the carbon industry. But Shell have just put up £100 million for skilling of 15,000 people in the years ahead, starting from the beginning of next year. Those kind of initiatives, whether people are worried about where the money comes from or not, are absolutely crucial, because we can't do it through public funding alone.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive answer. And I think I'm nearly out of time, but I've got one more question, I think. We're just getting the mic to that person, David.
Thank you. Yes, Stephen Evans from the Learning and Work Institute, and I wanted to ask, I should probably make this a pithier question given what you've just said, Naomi, about time, but I wanted to ask a little bit about culture, because we've talked about policy, but you did a lot of work, David, on Skills for Life when you came into government, and a lot of great work over that period of time. It feels like the national policy and actually local policy priority in some areas has dropped off from that. And also with employers, you know, we talk about reform of the levy. I think there's definitely more we can do there. But also employers are investing 28% less per person in training than they were in 2005. So it feels like there's a kind of cultural point about those essential skills, but also about employers. And I'm just interested in your reflections about what we might do about that, or is there good practice we can build on?
Well, government can take a lead, and just to be non-party political, Gillian Keegan, with her own experience and background and her declared commitment in relation to this agenda, I hope we'll be able to start a process in which Keir Starr's government can build on. The minister responsible for skills in this area was the chair of the select committee and is declared committed to the agenda. I hope it will be an embracing one rather than just concentrating on T-levels and apprenticeships, important as they might be. But yes, a cultural change that understands that success in business comes from using the most important ingredient of any business, that's the people you employ, extremely well, developing their talent and creativity and adaptability to the new world of work and the changes that are with us is so fundamental that it's a no-brainer. But obviously you need to lead from the center. And if we could have that reinvigoration of the whole education, lifelong learning agenda, I think that business will respond to it. We do say that, by the way, at the beginning of the document, that this requires a cultural shift and not just a shift in funding or the restoration of substantial amounts of funding, both privately and publicly, that have been withdrawn over the last decade. But it's more fundamental even than just people paying lip service and changing the cultural attitude. It's actually grasping that you can build roads over the next 10 years. You can invest in the tech, but unless you've invested in the skills for people to be able to do the job now, then that growth, that productivity, that reduction in inflation, that greater balance within the economy of our country is just not going to happen. And I haven't actually been able to hear, obviously, what Jeremy Hunt said. I hope he said something about education, learning and skills, and not just that they're not going to cut the schools budget, which is already being decimated because of inflation. Sorry, that's a very long answer. Before I finish, Naomi, could I just thank Joanna, who's been desperately trying to get me online this morning and who is now going to go home to bed because she's actually ill and she came in to do this, and I'm very grateful to her, and I'm particularly grateful as well to all of your audience for your patience.
Thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause for our excellent speaker, David Blunkett? Thank you. Thank you so much. Right, we now in real life have lunch. I think some details are going to come up shortly about your workshops, which will happen straight afterwards. But thank you so much for all of your wonderful engagement this morning so far. We will have lunch. Can I just advise you, there is a lunch station just out there, but it's going to get very busy. We have 2 more lunch stations serving the same stuff in the exhibition hall, which is just the room next door. If you could go there and also take the time to go around the exhibition, which is great. And we've got some really wonderful people from brilliant organisations who are really excited about talking to delegates today. So please do go into the exhibition hall. And then straight after lunch, you won't come back in here unless you're in the workshop that's in here. We're running 4 workshops. The names of the rooms are on the screen, but there will be learning and work people who can help you. So there is the registration desk out there. If you're not sure where to go, please go and ask somebody, and we'll be rounding you up just shortly before 1:30 so you can get to your rooms on time as well. So thank you again, enjoy your lunch, and please do go to the exhibition. Thank you.